everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Since it's been getting so warm outside, it made me really want to make a summer dress. And I have this fabric that I'm going to use to make it. I've had this for a while and couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with it, but now I know exactly what I want to do, which is make a summer dress. And I got it at the thrift store for $3.99. I'm not sure what it was, but I think it might have been a tablecloth before. But either way, I think it's really pretty because as you can see, it's like this lacy fabric, and I think it would make a really nice breezy summer dress. And I'm so excited. So let's get started.
So I started out by cutting out my pattern pieces. I cut them all out of my lining first because I'm going to put the other main fabric on top and cut it out. For the lining, I'm just using a bed sheet that I happen to have in my closet. For the pattern, I used my body measurements to make these pieces. The back piece is cut on the fold and the front bust piece will be gathered, so that's why we're using the whole front length even though it's cut in half. I hope all these measurements make sense, but if it doesn't, just let me know, and I'll try to answer it to the best of my abilities. Once they were cut out of the lining, I put the lacy fabric on top and cut out the general shape of the pattern, making sure to leave some excess so that we can make sure it fits to the exact shape when we cut it later. Because next we're going to be basting all around the edges. To baste it together, I pinned the lining and lace together and sewed all around the edges, staying within the seam allowance so that the stitching won't be seen at the end. And basting is just when you use the longest stitch length just so the fabric is together. It's kind of hard to see the white fabric on the white table, so sorry about that. After that, I trimmed the lace so that it was the exact same size and shape as the lining. I repeated this for all the pieces I just cut out, and when doing the two front bust pieces, make sure that they are mirrored and not facing the same way, because then it won't work out later. And once that was done, this is what they all looked like. After I made those pieces, I decided that I wanted to add a little something extra, which was two little lace-up portions on the waist pieces. So to do that, I cut a panel for the center and two for each side, two out of the lining and one out of the lace. I put them right sides together, sandwiching some loops so that when it's turned right side out, there will be something for the lacing to go through. And for the loops, I just used a white ribbon that I found somewhere. And when doing the different panels, I put them next to each other while doing it so that I can make sure that the loops were even with each other. And this is what they looked like before I put the other piece on top and sewed down where the loops were. And once I turn them inside out, they should look like this. I also pressed them flat before putting them on the waist pieces and sewing it down. I laced one side up to see if I liked it, and I did in fact like it, so I continued on with the dress. Oh yeah, and this is what it looked like. For the next step, I put the bust pieces right sides together and sewed up the center, but I didn't sew all the way up. I left a little bit unsewn so that we can put in the strings later to gather it up. I pressed the seam allowance open and sewed down the unsewn parts so that it would stay in place. And now I could gather the bust piece to the waist piece. I marked about under the shoulder points and gathered it to the waist piece, for which I also marked a little ways in so that it wasn't gathered all across the underbust. To do this, I put two parallel basting stitches without back stitching where I wanted to gather it, and I pulled on the top threads of each side, making the fabric gather up. I marked the center when gathering so that the gathering would be more even, and then I sewed down the gathers and removed the basting stitches. Now I could add the back piece. I sewed the side seams together using French seams, which is where you sew them wrong sides together, trim down the seam, and then sew them right sides together, encasing the seam allowance to create a strong finished seam. Then I went on to the skirt. I wanted a layered skirt, so I cut one shorter than the other. And for the width, I didn't really measure it, I just kind of eyeballed it. And I did want it quite gathered, so I made sure to make it plenty wide. And I made both skirts the same width, one was just a little bit longer than the other. I don't know if you noticed, but this tablecloth had a little trim edging thing, and I considered putting it around the hem of the skirt, but after thinking about it, I decided that it might weigh down the dress, which I wanted very flowy. Plus, it was looking a little yellow, which might ruin the look of the dress. I put the edges of the skirt together and sewed it up to make it one big loop. And then I placed the skirts on top of one another and basted them together so that I only had to gather them once to the bodice. And I think I used French seams for this as well. To gather it, I used the same method as the bust part, where I put two parallel lines of stitching and pulled on the thread. I intentionally made the front of the skirt more gathered than the back because I knew that I was going to shear the back, which would contribute to the gatheredness of the skirt. And once it was pinned together, I just sewed it all down. Then I made a lining so the skirt wouldn't be, see-through. I just cut out a panel about the size of the waist of the bodice, and I made the edges slanted just for fun. You don't really need to do that. And just like the other skirt, I sewed it into a loop before attaching it to the bodice. This one doesn't have to be gathered because it should fit pretty closely anyways, and if it is a little bit bigger, then I just kind of scrunched it in place. Then I hemmed the top of the bust portion after trimming it a little because it was a bit too long. I took a strip of fabric and folded in both sides to make these casings to gather the bust. I sewed about a centimeter down from the top of the bust like this, and I did this to both sides so that it looks like this. I took a piece of thin ribbon and threaded it through the casing and put a few stitches on the end closer to the armhole to make it stay in place. If you don't have ribbon, you can always just make this yourself using some thread and folding it really thin and sewing it down. And once both pieces are in, it can be gathered up like this. Now on to the back. My plan was to shear it, which is where you use elastic thread on the bobbin, making the fabric gather up. You want to make sure to wind up the bobbin by hand and that you're not stretching it when doing so. I had to try out a few different tensions and stitch lengths until I got it working how I wanted it, but when I did, I sewed a bunch of rows on the back piece. I used the presser foot to gauge how far apart the rows were so that I didn't have to mark out each row because that would be a lot of work and I didn't want any marks left behind on the white fabric. And the elastic thread will most likely run out, so you're gonna have to wind it up a few times. And this is what it looked like once that was done. To make it stretchier, I steamed it using the iron. And you'll see that it also makes the elastic shrink, which further gathers the fabric. Next, I made the straps. This was pretty easy. I just got a long strip of fabric that I sewed right sides together and then turned right sides out. I wanted the straps to tie together at the top into a bow, so after turning it right sides out, I cut each one in half. I pinned it to the shoulder points in the back, and then before sewing it, I just tried it on to see how it would look. And I was very glad I did this because it looked horrible. It was so ugly that I knew I needed to come up with something different. For plan B, I decided to make mid-length puff sleeves. I couldn't decide if I wanted a long one or short one, so I just decided to go right in the middle and make it mid-length. I cut it out of just the lace and I made the basic sleeve shape with a long shoulder part so that it can become a puff sleeve. And I sewed up the sides and sewed the curved part to the armscye of the dress. I used French seams for this just so that the seam would be stronger, and then I hemmed the shoulder curve. I added the same fabric casing like I did for the bust to the shoulder and the bottom of the sleeve. I put it a few centimeters away from the edge so that when it was gathered with the elastic, it would have a nice frill to it. I cut pieces of elastic that comfortably went around my arm and shoulder and threaded it through the appropriate casing. And I also made sure to sew the elastic so that it would stay the way I wanted it to. For the bottom of the sleeve, I just sewed the elastic into a loop, and then for the shoulder portion, I sewed down each side of the elastic to the fabric of the dress. And even with the shirring, the back of the dress was still a little bit baggy, so I added a piece of elastic to the top of the back and at the waist of the back. And I stretched it while sewing it with a straight stitch to make it gather up. And for the finishing touch to the dress, I put the lacings in the little loops. I really liked how it looked, but I thought it would look even better with a matching bow, which is what I made next. Oh yeah, and I also forgot to take out the gathering stitches in the skirt, so I also did that. For the bow pieces, I cut out the top of the bow, the ribbon, and the little middle portion that holds it all together. For the top of the bow, I cut the fabric twice as wide and twice as long as I want the final piece. For the ribbon that goes underneath, I cut it just twice as wide as I want it. And for the middle portion, I cut out the rectangle significantly bigger than I think I needed. If you've seen any of my other videos where I make a bow, it is pretty much the same process. I fold the top part of the bow in half and sew it before turning it inside out and sewing the ends to the middle. For the bottom of the bow, I sew up all the sides but slanting each end and leaving a little bit unsewn so that I can turn it right side out. And once it's right side out, I just sew up the unsewn part. And I took the middle portion and folded it over several times until I got the width I wanted. Then I used it to scrunch up the top and bottom of the bow together and hot glued it in place. I also added a blank barrette to the back of the bow so that I could put it in my hair. And I found it helpful to first use a rubber band to put it all together before gluing it so that it's easier to make it look nice. For the scrunchies, I wanted to make two, so I cut two rectangles. The size of them depends on how big you want the scrunchies, and I wanted mine to be pretty big, so I cut them out pretty big. I first sewed the ends together to make one big loop, and I'm gonna show you a little trick which makes making scrunchies super fast and easy. I don't know if everyone already knows this, but in case you don't know, it's very helpful. So basically, you layer the loop on top of the other side of the loop and fold it up so it fits when the scrunchie is put right size together. And you are going to sew here, and as you sew, you can keep pulling the fabric in the middle until you make it all the way around the scrunchie. I hope this makes sense. But make sure you keep a portion open so that you can still insert the elastic afterwards. And before you know it, you have a fully completed scrunchie just without the elastic. So you just thread it through and sew the ends of the elastic together. And then you sew the opening closed. And you have yourself a scrunchie. And I made two of them because I wanted to, so I just repeated this all over again, and they turned out just as big and fluffy as I wanted them. And this was the finishing touch to my whole project, and so now it's all done. I love how this summer dress turned out. I think it's perfect for the summer with how light and breezy it is. It was super windy on this day that I wore the dress, so it was kind of hard to get this shot. But if you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and see you next time.